coming. Just to orientate you, I'm Dave Haslam, and this is David Scott. It's like Dave and Dave plus one. It's like your TV, basically. And we're here primarily to talk about David's book, which he's going to hold up now, Mancunians, which is published by Manchester University Press. I was first published in 1999, so I have have 5 full-length books and 5 short format books like this. I have asked permission to do a short reading right at the end, just to represent my work. But as I say, we're primarily talking about the book Mancunians. And I wanted to just start off by asking you, I mean, there's books about Manchester, more and more books about Manchester. It's almost a monthly thing now. When you proposed this book, what was the unique point of this book? What did you think that you could bring to this that other books hadn't?
I think it was initially the sort of lived experience of actually growing up within the city. A lot of the times when you read books about Manchester, it's very much from an outside perspective, or it focuses on one thing. So I think having grew up during the time when the book's set, I think that gives me sort of a unique perspective. I don't usually see many books that do that from a biography point of view. And then the other side of it was to try and give more of the voices to other people, because I wanted it to be like a documentary in book form. That was my idea of it, because I didn't want first and foremost it to just be one narrative about what Manchester was like. Because I think a lot of the time it's like, all right, well, this is Oasis is Manchester, this is the Hacienda's Manchester. I want to try and, as much as possible, offer like a 360 take, and have voices that sort of contrasted and stuff. And I think that was what was quite unique about trying to do it that way.
Yeah. So in a way, the book there's at least kind of 3 threads to the book. There's your own autobiographical memories and your kind of take on what was going on in your life. And then obviously there's the kind of historical context that you place that in. But then, as you say, there's a lot of extended quotes from a series of people, and they are extended quotes. Yeah. So you don't just kind of take out a sound bite.
No.
I mean, Guy Garvey, has donated hundreds of words to your book.
Yeah.
How did you choose those interviewees, and how many did you do in the end?
I think I interviewed over 170, and I think we got it down to maybe 40 or something in the end. But the choosing, it was really difficult, but it grew organically. Like I'd ask one person if to do it for an interview, because I remember speaking to yourself, and then you maybe make a suggestion about somebody else, and all of a sudden we're getting this sort of network of contributors. And because I was focusing on such a period that hadn't been tapped into, around that sort of millennium, and people hadn't been written about, because Andy Hargreaves from I Am Clue said to me, I've been speaking to Guy about this book. And then Guy said, well, he wants to help, because nobody's ever mentioned that sort of that period at the year 2000. And I think that was the case for a lot of people. When speaking to Balladrone Boy and Andy Votel, they felt very similar. So they were more than forthcoming with their stories. And then obviously they have natural conversations, and then I'd get people getting in touch and say, all right, well, I want to be part of this, but why am I not in it? And it was...
Excuse me, I don't think some of us are hearing you very well. It's a bit... I think if you could speak out here.
Yeah, sorry.
Speak it a bit slower. And a bit slower.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, I'm not being...
I tell you what, I'll sit here next to you. You ask me the questions, and then...
Was anybody else struggling to hear? Me. Somebody else as well, or was it just me? Maybe it's just me, then I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Of course. We'll sit closer.
We'll sit closer.
Yes, well, that's another thing.
Yeah.
I've often wondered why people sit so far away. They've got to project the voices. Right, I'll shut up now. It's your turn.
No.
And now we've got to remember what we were talking about.
Yes.
Can anyone remind us? No. So the other thing is that I can tell that you also wanted to choose voices from parts of the Manchester community socially that we don't normally hear of. Was that also an aim of yours?
I just wanted to tell the truth of the Manchester that I grew up in, because you never really see this. Like, I grew up in South Manchester alongside, and the idea that it was just all about indie music with the haircuts, and there was that, but I never really, Manchester or Greater Manchester is supposed to be an area that celebrates diversity, but I don't think we do it as much as possible. So it wasn't so much that I got on a soapbox to try and say this is what it's like. I just wanted to tell the truth, really, and then offer the voices of people from different backgrounds, give them a pedestal, which I don't think we do often, and not just in book form, but in like media of the period.
Yeah, I mean, so the book is, you talk about the era the book is set in, and there are kind of three things that happen around within the space of 3 or 4 years, which is the Hacienda closing, and obviously the Hacienda had been such a big club, and you know, it dominated the way that people talked about what was happening musically in Manchester, for sure. And then there was, and just before that was the IRA bomb in 1996, and then there was the millennium, which, you know, we can't help but think of as being, you know, a new chapter. So you kind of start, don't you, in that late 90s period to take on the story after those particular moments have happened.
Because in many ways, I think 96 or around there, and I know your book, Manchester, England, that ends around 99, is that correct? So I knew we needed to do like a crossover, and I was looking at events from around that period, and you mentioned there the IRA bomb, which I think the anniversary is tomorrow, the 15th, is it the 15th of June? The Hacienda closing, and then me and the publishers decided to look at all the other stuff that was going on in Manchester at the time, and I was looking at the crime that was going on in South Manchester, and I was not personally involved, but I was caught up in a lot of the stuff that was happening regarding the gang problems in South Manchester, the nightlife that we don't talk about, because, I mean, and you spoke about this as well, Dave, and that the Hacienda is like, you know, that's what everyone thinks about Manchester, but you and yourself say that we don't talk about more of the other venues, so it's not like once the Hacienda closed, people stopped going out in town. So we need, like, why don't we talk about them stories? So then when I started talking to the staff at Night and Day on Oldham Street and stuff, and like Tash Wilcox, who used to run that place, I mean, and the stories that come out there, even the way it's made, just from me, from an outsider, we wouldn't have the likes of Ballydrome Boy or Andy Vortel or Elbow or any of them bands if they didn't have these spaces to create, and that's why institutions like that are so important today. So
one of the things that I found myself doing reading the book was actually kind of arguing with some of the voices. And I don't know if that was something that you were aware of, in the sense that there are so many voices and you wanted to tell a truth, but actually there's not a truth, is there? There's a series of people's experiences which are true for them.
Yes.
I've got an example.
I was hoping you were going to say which ones you didn't agree with.
Justin Morehouse, I like him, he's a lovely comedian, he lives near me, and we like to pass the time of day if we see each other in Didsbury. However, he says, Manchester was miserable before the bomb. So, 1996, which I just don't agree with. I understand there was a big change after that, but I was just thinking about all the things that people were doing in the early part of the 90s that wasn't the Hacienda. And I think sometimes people have a view that if they don't know what's going on somewhere, nothing's going on.
Yeah.
You know? So you can't always extrapolate from your personal experience. So it might have been miserable for Justin. I don't think it was, because I think those were his courting days. He was going out with quite a lot of women in the early 90s, you know? But there were definitely things that were happening in Manchester. I mean, around the time of Euro 96, which as people will know was, you know, around the time the bomb kind of hit just as Euro 96 was happening. There was a big program of cultural events, you know, and the Corner House was kind of at its height really in the mid-90s. So I just wanted to kind of make the point sometimes that people can, I think the only thing you can assume with Manchester is that there are things happening.
Yeah.
You know? Even if you don't know that, you have to accept that there are.
And I think that was one of the things I was trying to do. Not that I'd wanted, I like the idea that you were arguing with Justin Morehouse on the page though, is that I don't know if there is a thing as truth. I don't want to turn it into a philosophy, but everything is all down to interpretations. It's like, where do you live?
I live in Bolton.
Right, you live in Bolton, but your version of Bolton may be different. So do you live in Bolton? You might have different interpretations. So I think what I was trying to do by offering so many different voices is to show that it is impossible to sort of have one version of it. And I think in the past, especially with Manchester, we only tend to get one or two different opinions on what the city is, but it is so much more than that. So that was Justin Morehouse's Manchester, whereas I remember 1996, and take away the bomb, that was one of the best summers, you know, I don't know if it's me, but do you always look back and it was always sunny? Like, I don't know, like, if that's what the older you get, it always seems like it was hotter back when we were young. But I think when he was saying it was miserable in the city centre, to view.
Okay. I mean, so if we do accept, say, it was a bit miserable in the city centre, do you necessarily feel that the Manchester of now, which is more, on the surface, much more kind of glitzy, definitely more commercial, a lot of big business, do you think that that's necessarily been an improvement, or do you feel like some of the soul of the city has gone?
I think we've definitely lost something in our quest for progress. I always liked the bit of seediness or the spit and sawdust bars and stuff, and I think that when you get everything that's so gentrified or sort of sterilised in a way, I think, and you look at Manchester city centre today, every bar is pretty much the same, like hipsters and so on and so forth, and it's not a diss at them, but they were unique for a time when there's one bar that's doing it. But, you know, it just becomes, it's like a theme park, I think.
It becomes homogenous in the sense that it's not much different to what's on offer in Liverpool or Birmingham or Leeds. You lose the individuality when big business moves in, because all the chains are in charge, you know? I mean, when the print works opened and they had Alex Ferguson and Lionel Richie, which is kind of the weirdest combination ever, that wasn't necessarily a good sign that creative stuff was going to come out of the print world.
No.
Right, I want to move it on, because really early on in the book, there's a chapter about education. And which I like that, because it's not, you know, it's not the sexiest thing people write about Manchester, you know? But it was I really enjoyed the chapter, and it was where your personal experience together with other voices I think really worked. So could you just tell us a little bit about the kind of school you went to and your experiences?
Yeah, I think lack of education might have been a better way to put it. Yeah, so I went to a school called Spurley Hay in Gorton, and I left in 1997. It was only many years later that I found out the year I left, we were the second worst performing school in the whole of the country, which is strange, and you're not aware of that at the time because your school's always better than somewhere else's, or you don't realise how bad it is, and you'd never think it was that bad. But we had just supply teachers all the time, like we were always wagging it, because it was more like a badly run youth club than it was a schooling system. And there was a lot of sort of violence in there, and on the outside of school, I think I did a lot more growing up or learning things from peers or from people in the pubs or stuff. That was my education, and I think music played a massive part in that, in terms of listening to lyrics, and like hip hop was so important for me as an education system, because I was listening to these lyrics and like, all right, well, who's Malcolm X? And I remember watching the Malcolm X film, the Spike Lee film, and I'd just off my own back written this whole essay on Malcolm X, and I brought it into the English teacher the following week, and she goes, "What's this? Who's Malcolm X?" And it completely oblivious, and there was no real encouragement to do anything. I think the year I finished high school, there were 3 of us that finished with 5 GCSEs or stuff, and we were sort of getting ready to go to factories or to work on the roads and stuff. And I'm not knocking them careers at all, but it was becoming like a production line, I suppose.
And was it something like 10 pupils excluded per day?
Yeah.
like at 10
That
extra.
was across Manchester, though.
10 extra.
Yeah.
So every day, 10 pupils who turned up to school did whatever they did and ended up getting excluded for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
So there were lots of kids out on the street because the schools were like, it was kind of because the schools wanted to try and obviously maintain control of the pupils, but they also wanted to kind of, in a way, look good, you know?
Yeah.
We're not going to stand for this. But at the same time, for the neighborhood, it's not great to have loads of school-age kids wandering the streets.
I mean, that's what we were, though. I mean, even when we weren't kicked out of school, there was we were a lot like tribes wandering Manchester trying to find something to do because there was very little entertainment. And like, I don't know how, when you all had your first drink, I think I was like 12, 13 when I first had a drink of cider. And there was nothing else to do because there was no youth clubs, everything just seems to be shutting down. So we'd spend our days and nights in the park and stuff. And that becomes a slippery slope. And I think I mentioned it in one of the other chapters, is that then drugs get involved because like something else is a source of entertainment, and then it sort of spirals out of control. But we were very much, like we had fun in spite of stuff. Like we had to make our own fun. But the education system was, I've got 3 daughters, if they had to go to a school that I went to, I'd be horrified, like the sort of stuff that went on. So
you feel that there's progress that's been made since then?
I think so. I mean, I go teaching in schools at the moment, and I think there's a massive sort of lack of support for teaching staff, and they're trying their best, particularly in Manchester because the population because we're growing at such a rate. And there's more schools going up. I'm not too sure how well they're handling it, but compared to when I was in high school, and the irony is the year I left was when New Labour got in. And then I think it was Blunkett came into with power with Tony Blair and said, right, we're going to put all this money into the schooling system. And I'm like, well, that's great for future generations. But like we were I think we're the last year under a Tory government for like 17 years, and in many ways sort of a lost generation. And then one of the later chapters, we talk about like crime, and you sort of see the thread. Like I'd never really paid much attention to it as to why people fall into gang or life of crime problems. But once I started putting them in these blocks of like education system, there was like social care, and it's like, well, that's all the options there are for you, really. And a life of crime doesn't seem that bad if you've not been set up with a school system to give you education to get you into better jobs. If someone's offering you, I don't know, £100 to just go and sell some drugs, whereas you're not going to get that back. It automatically looks like something that why wouldn't you want to do that?
There are a couple of teachers that you mention. I think it's often the way people have a relatively negative view of their school days, but there are often a couple of teachers that they remember who got them interested in, for example, literature.
Yeah.
And you mention, well, you don't call them by their real name.
I was told the publisher said I couldn't do that.
Mr. M1.
That was Mr. Miller.
And Miss E.
Miss Evans.
Miss Evans. So Miss Evans got you into writing, literature?
Yeah,
books?
pretty much. Like I'd go into school, and because there was never any sort of set curriculum for creativity, but I'd write these short stories or anything at home. And I love my parents, but they're not readers, and they weren't ready to, they were more concerned about putting food on the table than reading the son's silly little stories. But Miss Evans was a massive source of influence, and you need that as well at that age, I think, to sort of say, yeah, this is good, or just the encouragement that you might be doing the right thing, or you're allowed, even you're allowed to be a creative, because that was always a massive hurdle well into my 30s as well, that people from my backgrounds didn't become writers, or they didn't become poets or artists of any stage. It just didn't happen at all. So to have that one person behind you, that meant everything to me.
So you mentioned before about the drug issue and kids getting attracted to working at some level in the drug trade, or at least consuming drugs as well as a kind of a distraction or a source of fun even for kids. And you talk about, because I remember when I finished my book in 1999. The gang issue in Manchester was Salford, Cheetham Hill, Moss Side. Those were the ones where they had a considerable amount of firearms. I actually met a guy in Moss Side who'd got a bazooka. He's still got a bazooka. His crew have got a bazooka, and he's not used it. I'm hoping he's kind of kept it.
Yeah.
You know, it's not gone rusty in his back garden. But they're the kind of people that were actually, you know, to get serious, were capable of killing each other.
Yep.
With those gangs. But actually, just at that time, as you were becoming an older teenager, the area around where you were, Longsight, for example, Levenshulme, Gorton, particularly Longsight, that actually suddenly kind of inflamed, didn't it, as a gang area?
Yeah.
And I mean, what are your memories of that? Because there was the Pitbull crew,
Yeah.
for example. There were some very nasty people who were operating kind of in a way in your part of Manchester.
Yeah, not just operating in my part of Manchester. Some of them were friends, Dave, you know, like, because for me, somebody who was just 16, and this is when they first got into the gang life, it was no different to selling drugs as it was to selling a newspaper. That was pretty much how it was seen. It's just like that was seen as another job, but then very quickly you become apparent to, you know, the downside and the effects of it. But because you've had no awareness of what that gang culture can do at the time, it was glamorized, I think, in some ways, but it was ridiculously violent. But again, I only saw that in hindsight, because at the time it felt completely normalized behavior to be meeting your mates for a game of football and there being yellow tape around one end of the park because someone had got shot. That was completely normal. I mean, like, I think, like, now I look back and think that's traumatic, but like, there's a scene in there where one of my friends got really badly addicted to heroin, and he killed himself for it because he didn't tell any of his friends that he was going through this pain. And I actually saw his body bag coming out of his house over Christmas. And then that was it. And then that was the conversation. Oh yeah, Kevin hung himself last night. And then you move on, and then there's something else, and it's just the local pub, Farmers, where we used to drink. And Stephen Roberts got shot in the stomach that night. And I had to tone down the amount of people that I knew that had been shot or killed, in, like, just because I didn't want to, like, go on and on and on. But it just felt that it was so normal.
Yeah.
You know?
And the crucial thing is that if somebody in that environment gets shot, it isn't a wake-up call for everyone to improve their behaviour.
No.
It is the trigger for retaliation and an increase in violence.
Yes.
So once it's spiralling, it's out of control, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, it was a bit like a soap opera, because in the same way I'd see my parents say, oh, what's going to happen in the plot twist at Coronation Street, we'd like be discussing in the park, oh, who's going to get so-and-so back for killing Marcus Goldbridge on Greenbank. And it didn't seem to want to be stopped either, really, not from police.
That's what I was going to ask you. What was the policing like? Very
rare, to be honest. I the only time I had any run-ins or saw police is when they used to just wind us up and throw us in the back of a van because it's like for hijinks, and then drive us miles away. But in terms of policing, it was next to nothing. When my next door neighbour who got shot in my local pub, you'd think now that you'd have like a CSI, I don't know, Bolton or crime scene there, and that. Like the following day, everyone was back in the pub,
yeah,
and just weren't sat at that table because that's where he got shot. Like, they didn't seem to be the one from the council or the police to stop any of these shootings. And I do wonder whether that was down to the demographic of the people who were killing each other. And I don't think I'm being cynical and saying if it was young white kids that were getting killed, then it would have been a whole different story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that historically that seems to be true, doesn't it? That, or somebody who's perceived to be quote unquote innocent dies, you know?
Yeah.
If if it's inter-gang violence or it's happening in a neighbourhood where there's a lot of gangs,
Yep.
it tends not to become such a big deal. But if somebody innocent or particularly young, like Benji Stanley,
Yeah.
gets killed, that becomes a story.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I asked this question when in the book, is that the police only ever want to stop the crime there and then. So that if someone shot someone, then they'll arrest them and send them away, which should happen. But because Manchester, or Greater Manchester, had like decade upon decade upon decade of gang problems, all stemmed from poverty. Why don't we look as to the reason as to why kids are going into like this lifestyle when it's more, I don't know, you choose the option that you could get into a career where you might either end your life or end somebody else's life, rather than go and, get the support network and go on to college and university. And I just feel like there's not the want from the political powers to stop it, because we can, like the gangs that are running the streets of South Manchester today are the grandkids from either the ones like in the 80s or 90s and stuff. And it's the same stuff, but why don't we stop the problem?
So why, if these kids had went to the same school as you, had the same education, why did their life turn out to be so involved in, firearms and violence?
Yeah.
And you started writing poetry.
Well, I didn't refer to it as poetry back then because, I might not have got shot for it, probably would have got beat up. For me, it was always like hip hop lyrics. I don't know, and sometimes, I don't know if this sounds a bit weird, like I get survivor's guilt in some way because there was no difference, really. I mean, everybody I know, there isn't the stereotype of single parents and who let their kids run amok and stuff. It's just, I sort of saw where they were going. I thought, I don't want to go down. I could have done, like, quite really, really easily. I don't know. Luck, I suppose, is more than anything, because I'd met enough people that were not great academically at school, because none of us really were back at Spurley Hay. But I think the impression is that if you're a drug dealer or you work in gangs and stuff, then you are stupid in so many ways. I think that might be the impression, but I think to get to a certain level of success, you have to have some sort of business smarts. So now if you've got someone who can do that in an illegal world, why can you not put them in? It just shows that, if you support them from a young age, then you can get a better life for them.
Mm. There's moving on to, there's another chapter in the book which is about venues, nightlife venues, and you mentioned night and day before. One of the things that happens, isn't it, when you're at an age 15 to 18, say, and wherever you're living, you start going out and you're kind of looking for somewhere. You don't really know where to go, basically.
No.
And so in Manchester, and in the book, you distinguish between, for example, a club that was around that time called Piccadilly 21. And I think I got a slightly negative reaction from somebody at the back, quite understandably. It wasn't a great club. Music wasn't particularly, pioneering.
Yeah.
And why am I being so careful not to diss Piccadilly 21? It was also a very dangerous place.
Yeah.
And then, so in the book you get a sense of the young Dave Scott walking around Manchester, going to Piccadilly 21 because people were there, your friends were there, and there might have been the odd bit of hip hop that you liked. But then you discover a venue called Night and Day on Oldham Street. So could you kind of explain the difference between those two venues and why you felt at home in Night and Day and as a consequence were around and kind of eyewitness to a new generation of Manchester music?
Yeah, I mean, who went to Piccadilly 21s? There was some, and survived, well done. I don't know, Piccadilly 21s was rough, but I think that's because of where it was in Manchester. You're straight off the bus, it's easy to get in. And do you remember the big sweeping stairs when you used to walk up? And it was just, it was full on cheese, it felt like 21s. But I first started going there because it was the only place that would let you in underage. And because of that, you've got a load of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds hammered on WKD and all these alcohol pops. And yeah, just going crazy. But it was vital. Like it did kick off and stuff, but it was just, I don't know, it felt like a youth club where we could just first get hammered, I think, particularly 21s. But it wasn't, not to get on my own backside, it wasn't very cultured, I suppose.
Or creative.
Or creative. No, but it's just like let loose sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it felt very dated even
So
back
what was
then.
Night and Day like?
So Night and Day, I mentioned this in the book because I ended up kissing a girl in Piccadilly 21s, and she'd had a boyfriend, and her boyfriend wasn't too impressed with me doing that. I don't know why. You know, 5 goals in Piccadilly 21s, and he ended up chasing me out of 21s.
And you took a sharp right.
Yeah,
and then
took
right
a sharp
again.
right, and I've literally got this huge meathead in like a rolled chain and a Lacoste, the proper like Rockport, chasing me down Oldham Street. And then I've took a, what's this bar here? It was crazy, and I like just slid in. Because it's so unassuming, wasn't it, Night and Day? Like, you wouldn't want to go, you know, it wasn't from the outside.
There weren't like 5 doormen.
Yeah.
There.
And
It was like one,
yeah,
maybe.
and I sort of like slid in there, and the next minute it's like, what's this place? And I just seen this meathead leg it past. And then I referred to it in the book, it was like Night and Day to me was like Narnia, because all of a sudden you are seeing a different side of Manchester. And I think I referred to before, my Manchester wasn't creative, there was no artists. And this is at a time where the Manchester music that I'd been sold was all just Oasis, and we never had anybody else. And then I'd started going back to Night and Day over the years, and you'd see people like Damon, Badly Drawn Boy, Guy Garvey, I Am Clue, Andy Botel, and you'd see these people who were just drinking in the bar and then starting to make a community of creatives which didn't exist anywhere else, especially in the absence of the Hacienda. There wasn't too many of these sort of hubs where like-minded people could go to. And then you look at what they've gone on to create from there. I genuinely think that generation of collective and Mancunian artists is, to refer to your book actually, Picasso, you know, if you look at all the sort of creators around that era, that time on the Northern Quarter just sort of reminded me very similar to 1920s Paris, because I'd like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and I just see the musicians, and they were very literate lyricists, and Damon and Guy, and but that for me was just, what is this place?
And the other thing about that place was it had a very good sense of kind of collective endeavour.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bit in the book where Guy Garvey says to you that when Damon, Badly Drawn Boy, won the Mercury Music Prize, which was the year 2000, and there was a little gathering for him, because everyone knew each other, and Guy said to Damon, you know, well done, you've done brilliantly, and he said something like, well, it's great for all of us.
Yeah.
It was that sense of, like I say, collective endeavour, which I think is very kind of inspiring idea. And
isn't that at odds with the sort of the personality of Oasis? Because they were very much as a band that we had all the nonsense of Oasis versus Blur, but it was very much like, we're doing this on our own thing, but you had this place where it was like a collective, doing a lots of different sort of stuff. And even Guy said that even if he wasn't into what somebody else was creating, the fact that somebody else was making something was just amazing to be part of that group. But for me, like, I never knew anyone who did that in Manchester at all. So it's probably the best thing that ever happened to me, actually, getting chased by that meathead out of 20.
So you mentioned Oasis. I'm going to kind of ask a slightly loaded question. What were the bad things about Oasis coming from Manchester and being so huge? What were the negative knock-on effects of that generally in the city, do you think?
I think because I don't think it's all their fault, to be honest. I know it's a loaded question, but I think a lot of it was down to the media were going to spin the narrative about who or what Oasis were, however they felt, and obviously the bad boy behaviour didn't help. But I think the press at the time held a mirror up to Manchester in a way that we hadn't in the past. And I think everything that happened with the Hacienda was brilliant, but that was still, I think it was more culty compared to Oasis, was probably more mainstream. I think that's fair to say. So then you had like a generation of Mancunians, and I'll admittedly be one of them, that saw the behaviour of Liam and Noel Gallagher and saw the haircuts and thinking, that's us on the telly, and it becomes that's the uniform that we're going to try on. And that extends to beyond the man in the pub who's all of a sudden got a feather haircut, whereas 2 years ago there's no way on earth he knew what one of them was. And there were some bad feather haircuts, Christ. Yeah. But it extends beyond that, because then when you have these figures of Oasis and they become totemic as a sound for the city, then you automatically get bands trying to mimic that.
Yeah. And it also, sorry to jump in, it also gives a sense, as you say, everything's mediated through the media, obviously. That's why those words are connected. And the media simplify the message. And yeah, the media was, Manchester, Oasis, and white guys in bucket hats.
Yeah.
Football fan white guys in bucket hats who get pissed up and listen to guitar music. But that became, as Oasis got bigger and bigger, that perception of the city got bigger and bigger. So that's why I asked that question, because I do feel that in a way it alienated a whole load of other people who, women in bands, black kids who wanted to make soul or funk. And I had it myself when I'm in a situation where sometimes I get phoned up by the press internationally, what's the next big thing? They always want to know what the next big thing is. And I did a festival in Italy, and they asked me to pick a band from Manchester to play at this festival in Italy. And I chose an all-female trio. And they just couldn't understand it. I mean, I think they would have completely freaked out if there'd been a black person among that, because their perception of Manchester music was 4 lads with guitars. That's not a question.
Was it Lines?
Lines.
Yeah. We were a fabulous band, aren't they? Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And I think that's long been a problem with Manchester as a brand. It's a brand of music, isn't it? Because I mentioned this in the book. It's that if there isn't one version of Manchester, then there isn't one thing as a Manchester music. But I think that we have the interpretation, like you can have it at HMV or Piccadilly Records, Manchester music. But what does that mean? Yeah. And I think it's a fallacy in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I remember DJing at South Nightclub. And a lad came up to me. I don't like taking requests, I have to say, and for reasons like this, what this lad did. And he just looked at me and he just went, Manchester music. He didn't say please, or hiya Dave, or I've got all your books. He just went, Manchester music. And I was like, I mean, it wasn't the time and place to have a discussion with him. It was South Nightclub at 1 a.m. on a Friday night. But I would have loved to have sat down with him and said, what are you talking about? Yeah. And not only is it, because my main point about that would be that it's when pride in Manchester becomes insular. And that pride in Manchester becomes parochial, or whatever the version of xenophobic would be for a city. And people stop being open-minded about other places and other kinds of music. And that isn't good for the kind of creative psyche of the city.
Do you think, that was back at the end of the 90s, but do you think that's become a thing now with our commercial success in the city centre? Because I always think there's a massive, we talk about that Tony Wilson quote of we do things differently here. I always think Manchester, I'd say Manchester city centre in particular, suffers from the same thing that we used to always knock the Cockneys for. Because it was always about, we hated arrogance. It was always that was always we'd try and take Southerners down a peg or two, like who do you think you are? Yeah. But I think in many ways Manchester suffers from that now.
The kind of confidence which is the city needs. There used to be a city council slogan, "Make it happen." or we're making it happen. That idea of that Manchester's got the confidence to do it for themselves, which goes back centuries, it goes back to the Chartists, you know, it goes back way before then, where you accept that London is never going to give you anything on a plate. You've got to do it yourself, you know? That's really important, but when the confidence becomes arrogance, then it stops being positive.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I don't think you need to compete with somebody else. Just do. I think Manchester used to always just do, rather than it was like scream and shout about it. But it looked, I think that plays part with the commercial success that they've got in the city centre, where it's, because I'm sure you'd agree that the Hacienda has become it's a commodity now, isn't it? It's the advertising brand of the city.
Yeah, I mean,
is that odds with what?
Going to see Hacienda Classical is like going to see Cliff Richard. Same thing. No different. Or in fact, Cliff Richard on a cruise.
Oof.
You know, because what does it mean?
Yeah.
It's a heritage thing. It's not. All the things that Hacienda stood for, unpredictability, being different, being pioneering, being like nobody else, really taking a risk with the music, being artistic and avant-garde. You don't get that at a night now.
But it still sells out and does really well.
Well, some of my peers want to, you know, that's their decision.
Yeah. But from an audience's point of view, isn't it, like, obviously there's a need for it?
Yeah, I mean, people like to have a drink and feel nostalgic and dance around. That's that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like, well, what's the message sending? Because I work Tony Wilson was a very difficult person to work with. But what I always liked about his attitude was, it's not just about that moment and that movement and that music, but it's what is the effect on the culture. And if that moment and that music is nostalgia, the effect on the culture is negative in my eyes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think we've said this a few times, we had a discussion in the past, is the whole Beatles problem that Liverpool has. And it's like it becomes an anchor, doesn't it? Because when's the last big band that came out of Merseyside? But there's been lots of great bands. But the one that is overarching Liverpool is the Beatles.
So we're going to go to audience questions in a moment. We've been talking for 45 minutes.
That's gone fast.
It's been a joy.
Thank you.
What are you going to do next? I mean, I first knew you as a poet, and you were very much a performance poet.
Yeah.
And you had your pseudonym, R Kid. Obviously, you have a broadcasting career as well. You've obviously turned your hand to a mixture of autobiography and social history. So you've got many paths that you could go down next. Have you thought about that?
I don't know. I never really planned much, Dave, but the writing has always been in one frame or another. It's just about telling stories. So if there's a different way of trying to tell, it depends on what story I want to tell next. I really want to write another book, but maybe more fiction. I don't know. I just want to enjoy making stuff rather than have the pressure of I've got a deadline or stuff. I'd like just try and, I don't know, enjoy myself.
Okay. So we do have time for questions. At the back there.
Oof. Between now and any decade of Manchester. Well, I'd like to have gone to the Hacienda in like '89 or stuff, because that was the best year, would you say?
Yep.
Probably then.
Probably.
Because I think towards the end of it, it was nowhere near as good. I don't know. I really enjoyed for all its warts and worry of when I grew up and the Hacienda wasn't there. I had such a top laugh, regardless. And I just don't know. I'd like to have experienced the Hacienda, but then at a cost of not being thrown down the stairs at Piccadilly 21s by bouncers. I mean, all unique experiences.
Yeah, the Hacienda doorman would have put you in the canal.
Yeah.
So be thankful.
I had a tendency to do that myself, to be honest, when I was about 17. Me and my friends used to compete who could, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, swim across the canal. And that was like, how none of us died is just beyond me.
We'll edit that out.
Yeah.
Of the video. Yeah.
No, I'd done a podcast interview where I was talking about a lot of the themes that are in the book, and a publisher, Manchester University Press, got in touch with me and said, would you be interested in maybe exploring if there's a book during that period? So I sat down and looked at it all and thought, right, well, this is what I'll do. And then I sent the proposal off, and then they said, okay, we'd be happy to print that. And then the fun started. It's a great idea, by the way.
Because of course, once they've gone, the stories have gone.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of hello Ella. You're doing a podcast. Or you interviewed your grandparent, didn't you? Your nana. And I was saying that we should definitely sort of record all these voices and stuff. So yeah, it's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, we're thinking of recording them.
Yeah.
But there might be people at Bolton Library who have archive. So it might not, I mean, publishing is great, but it's not the only way to keep those memories forever. But also sometimes people feel like they're not having an interesting life when actually they are, because the interest for future generations in their life are the kind of everyday things, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to my kids about the milkman coming. You know, they're like, oh, the milkman coming, you know, and if you're lucky, you'll bring a loaf of bread.
2 years, I think, all in. There's a lot of
Some of us should be able to do it in 1 year then.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But it was, I think the back end doing the editing process and it going back and forth took quite a lot. Well, that's my Manchester, like I say, but I interview other people in there, and there was a lot of variety of clubs, but there seemed to be a variation on the same thing, whereas Discotheque Royales wasn't too much dissimilar to 21s and stuff. It was just cheesy bars all plotted around Manchester. There was very little to be unique. I wish I did, but this was the point that I was trying to make. It was only years later that I was aware that any of this sort of creativity that was actually happening in Manchester. The idea of going and seeing a foreign film would be completely like, what? You know, like, and that's because the naivety of where I grew up, and we were never exposed to that film. And then now I absolutely love like European cinema, but back then it was. Yeah, I think it's a change that's inevitable where we're moving now, and the rate of, I hate it being referred to as progression, because you can't say that Manchester sells itself as being one of the greatest destinations on earth. That's what Lonely Planet say, or Time Out magazine. But then when I come off the Mancunian way into the city centre and I see panhandlers or homeless people, their Manchester isn't the greatest place on earth. Or the food banks isn't the greatest place on earth. I think we're losing massively. I think Dave touched on it earlier on, a sort of character of what Manchester is, and not a stereotype, but because we places like Night and Day may no longer exist. I don't think there is as much a necessity, Night and Day, as it was back then, because I think the way the world moves through online, I don't think they need it.
I mean, I think that in terms of nightlife, I think Manchester's as good now, if not better than ever. I mean, there's some fantastic venues. I mean, one of the reasons people talk about the Hacienda all the time in the 80s was it was one of the few places in the 80s where you could go to Manchester dressed like a weirdo and not get a bottle broken over your head, because we were the weirdos, basically. Whereas now there's a whole range of venues. I mean, Albert Hall's a great place, I think, to see bands, and there's a lot out on the outskirts.
It's around that place though, when you were talking about like if you were dressed as a weirdo, you might get a bottle thrown at you. I always think that we don't give credit to places like Affleck's Palace or Night and Day in the same way. They're not revered as much as the Hacienda, but I see them as the foundation blocks for what the Northern Quarters become. I always wanted to have the balls to dress like people did in the Affleck's Palace, but because I grew up in Longside, there was no way I was having dreads on my ear pierced or anything like that, as much as I wanted to, because I would get done in. But now you look at the Northern Quarter and it's just so accepting of what you can be, dress however you want. That can only be a wonderful thing, and I think that sometimes if we hold back with the nostalgia that we're losing out on stuff, I just think you can only look forward. I mean, I obviously look back behind this book, but but yeah, I think as a city, then
I agree,
look forward.
To get myself out of answering that question, I always say, never ask a 61-year-old man where the cool place for the kids is. Because if a 61-year-old man has discovered it, it is almost by definition not cool. So I don't know.
And on that note, I think we call these right. Can we give a round of applause, please?
Thank you.